Greetings. All right. So in this video, what we're going to be doing is creating a histogram in R using the base graphics. We're not going to be touching ggplot, just the base graphics. Now, the function that we'll end up using to create this histogram is hist. Now, to give ourselves a little bit of a picture about this, something we can always do is pull up the help function and look it up. All right, so what we can see here is, yes, it gives us a histogram. That's exactly what we want. Right here, we can see this basic syntax where we need to type hist in all lowercase, parentheses, and then the one immediately required argument is x. Now, when we look down to the actual arguments, we can see what x is actually supposed to correspond to, a vector of values for which the histogram is desired. So what scores do you actually want to create a histogram of? Now, in our case, we have a vector of IQ scores, specifically 1,000 different scores with a mean roughly approximate to 100 and a standard deviation roughly approximate to 15. So, other functions that we'll want to pay attention to would be breaks. Now, breaks is essentially how many different breaks between the bars you want. So, if you specify 15 breaks, you end up with 16 class intervals or bins. Whether you want to look at frequency or probability, whether you actually want to sort of change the color of the graph, the color of the borders on the bars of the graph, different main titles, axis labels, axis limits. If you actually want to plot it versus just create a frequency distribution, you can actually adjust that here as well. So, without further ado, let's get going. Now, I always like to create these types of functions in the scripting tab because it's going to let me absolutely comment what I'm coding to death. Now, I strongly advise, especially if you're just learning R syntax, to comment absolutely everything to the point where it seems incredibly obnoxious. But if you're just learning it, you can't look at the code and know what the code means. So you need to actually give yourself a little note right in there. So let's get started. So I already created my first comment to let me know what I'm doing. I don't need this help up any longer. What I can actually do is go about. So I want to create a histogram of my IQ scores. Now I can hit enter and I can see that I have this nice pretty histogram here sitting. Now there are some problems with it. I might want to change perhaps the x-axis label or the y-axis label. Histogram of IQ isn't exactly what I'm looking for, and nor is this graph the most aesthetically pleasing graph possible. So let's go about this. All right, so coming up here, you can actually, in a script, break up a function across multiple lines, which I highly advise. In part because it lets you comment every single argument that you need to put into this function. So I enter the little hashtag or pound sign, whatever you want to call it, and then I type up the little note for the human here in the equation, which happens to be me. Now, R won't read this code or try and execute anything. It knows that, hey, it's just for the programmer. So probably the first variable that you're going to want to change, the first argument you're going to want to customize is breaks. So how many class intervals do we want? Somewhere between 10 and 20 is kind of a sweet spot that I like to work with. And so we can go about and change those class intervals. There's the keyboard shortcut, and we can see we've actually really increased the number of class intervals that we have, and we have a little bit more information here to work with in terms of our data. All right. Now we can go about changing those different axis titles and labels. So let's give our graph a new main title with the function main, where we then specify a string that gives us our new name. In this case, let's go with histogram of IQ scores as opposed to just IQ. Let's give ourselves a new x-axis label where we have IQ scores, and maybe a new y-axis label. Oh, typo. Y-axis label, which we'll call frequency. All right. Now, one thing that you'll note that I missed on my little functions is adding a little comma. And I'm also going to move my comments over, just they all are going to end up in line, which is not necessary, but it's something that will that I want to do because that's just me. All right. So again, it's obnoxious to comment every single argument in a function, but it does mean that you will know what every single part is. And again, if you are just learning, this is the way to go. And honestly, once you type it in once, it's there. It doesn't detract from R. You lose absolutely nothing by commenting. And the time that you actually spend commenting is extremely minuscule compared to the time that you could end up spending debugging if you're not sure what everything is. All right, so we generated that new graph by running this line of code. Now we can see I have histogram. That's not what I want. I can't type. All right, let's get this straight. Histogram. There we go. All right, histogram of IQ scores. And then we have IQ scores on our x-axis and frequency on our y-axis, which is what we were shooting for all along. Now, you can change the x and y-axis limits. I would probably accept roughly what we have right now anyway, but if you wanted to go about doing that, the functions that you would need to use would be xlim for x-axis limits. Now, when you enter this function, you actually need to enter a vector with two values, with the first value corresponding to your lower limit. In this case, let's go with 50, and an upper limit, which we'll set at 150. And then the same sort of syntax applies for your y-axis limits. Ylim equals C for combine, 0, and then let's actually kick this up to 175. Oh, missed a comma. All right, and again, you lose nothing from commenting your code. Yeah. Your comments do not actually need to line up perfectly, but neat and clean makes it easier to read. So we can enter those y-axis limits. You can notice that our y-axis did shrink a little bit, and we changed a little bit, but it's basically the same graph in this instance. Now, the next thing that you can do is change the color that you want your bars to be. In this case, let's say we wanted, we were feeling sassy and we wanted pink bars. We can actually specify that color. And we can see that we have those nice, pretty pink bars there. We can also specify the color we want for the borders. Let's say we wanted red borders and we actually want to come back and switch this to black. Another thing to note is when you specify these colors, they need to be in quotes. All right. And also, again, broken record, but comment your code. All right, so we've got those done. Now, it may be the case that you want to match the colors in your histogram Exactly. And you can see an application for this if you were creating a poster presentation that you're going to take to a conference to present your data representing your school. Perhaps you wanted to match your school colors. Perhaps you wanted to match the colors of your institution, whatever it happens to be. Perhaps you just really, really, really like the color turquoise or whatever it happens to be. Now, one thing you can do is if you actually just Google HTML color codes, we can actually input HTML color codes to get the exact example and the exact color you want. Now, if you just Google HTML color codes, you will find a plethora of sites that give you these nice free calculators, these nice free sort of pickers that let you decide whatever color you happen to want. So, let's say that our school colors were, actually, yeah, let's go with a nice pretty shade of green. Maybe a nice Irish green per se. Then we can actually copy this color code right here. And then instead of having, say, red as our border, we can come in here and we paste that HTML color code to give us that green. It looks like that green is going to be a little white, a little light for the black. And then we can get our histogram, whatever colors that we, happen to want. All right, so that's essentially creating histogram in the R-based graphics. Have a good one.